So I came across a video titled Richard Feynman, Why It Is Logically Impossible for God to Exist. And that title caught my interest because logical impossibility is a really strong claim. And so I wanted to listen to the video. It should be said, though, that although the title makes that broad claim, the actual content in the video doesn't try to make that strong of a case. So it wouldn't be fair to hold the video responsible for that. What it does offer is four specific problems with the concept of God. I thought they were interesting, and so I thought I would respond to the video anyway. And I should say the video, the voice very much seems to me to be AI. It doesn't seem like it's an old recording of Feynman. Feynman died in 1988, I believe. And so it's certainly not Feynman speaking. So the ideas might be his, they might not be, and be put in Feynman's mouth. I really just don't know that these arguments came from Feynman. And so what I'm going to do is I am going to respond to the substance in the video. Whatever the source, the ideas presented are interesting and worth responding to. But since at least the AI voice is not Feynman, I'm just going to call him the speaker throughout this video. So you'll see me refer to him as the speaker, and that would be the reason why. I don't really know who's giving these arguments. But anyway, whoever gave them, it's more interesting about the content than it is the speaker anyway. So I want to say up front, the speaker's challenges are not weak or superficial at all. He's raising issues that do demand a response and with which many Christians struggle. So while I do think the objections have valid responses, I want to imply or say right up front that I don't think the content is superficial or silly or anything like that. These are real issues that deserve a response. And so I want to say that up front. And so I will say the responses do get technical in a couple of places. And I try to make it straightforward, but honestly, some of it is just, it's technical, and so it's going to sound technical. I'll do my best, however, to make it easy. And my hope is not to dunk on anyone. The speaker or somebody struggling with these issues. I do think that there are refutations to these objections, pretty decisive ones, but I don't want to imply that people struggling with the objections are silly either. These are real issues. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over the four problems using the speaker's labels: the definition problem, the interaction problem, the complexity trap, and the knowledge problem. And I'll take them in that order. So the first issue is the definition problem. And the claim is that you can't really evaluate a claim until you know what the claim is. He says if you ask 10 people to define God, you're going to get 10 answers. There's no set definition of what's meant by God. And he gives an example of the blog, which is an entity with no mass, no energy, no causal power. It's undetectable in principle. Its presence is just indistinguishable from its absence. And so he says if there's no properties to differentiate a universe with God from one without, then God is a word without any meaning. It's just sort of a label. It doesn't mean anything. So I do want to say that he's right that we need to know what we're talking about. If the word God doesn't have a specific feature of the world that it picks out, then it's hard to evaluate any claims involving that term. And the standard he gives is differentiation. A universe with God should look different from one without. And I think those are good criterion. And it's worthwhile to note that in theology, a lot of people say that we can only use what are called negative predications of God, negative predications. That is, we predicate or we assign something to God, but only what's not true of God, saying what God isn't, the negative part. So, for example, saying that God is immaterial is to say he is without matter. It's to say what he's not like. He's not like matter. Saying that he's omnipotent is to say that he has without limits on his power. He's powerful, but it's without limit. What we're saying is that there's not a limit. And so to the speaker's point, if you've negated away every property, if all that you're doing is saying what something isn't without ever saying what it is, then it's tough to say that you've got more than just a label. And so that really is a position in theology. And again, it's a reasonable takeaway. But what I would say is that even negative theology gives more than his blog example, whatever it is. So first of all, pure negations aren't empty. So even a negative predication, it's not devoid of meaning. It does rule out particular worlds. So for example, if God's immateriality, well, it rules out a purely physical universe. The universe isn't purely physical if there's this immaterial being, God, in it. God's necessity rules out a brute contingent universe. The universe, excuse me, contingent refers to it's possible that it exists or doesn't exist. A brute contingency would be something that doesn't have to exist, but there's no explanation for why it exists. Well, God's necessity, that it's not possible that God doesn't exist, would rule out a brute contingent universe. So his Bloch example was defined as undetectable in principle. He defined it in that way. For example, as having no causal power. And certainly we wouldn't want to say that as God. So I think his analogy, it gets a bit past its skis in that way. And so what I would say is that negative descriptions themselves do have positive content about God. So just because it's a negative predication, saying what he isn't, it is saying something positive. So for example, omnipotence, power without limit. Well, that's incompatible with weakness, any sort of weakness in God. That's incompatible. Omniscience is knowledge without limit, but it would be incompatible then with ignorance. And so we are saying positive things about God. Having knowledge, obviously that's a thing. Having power, causal powers, that is a thing. There are such things as abstract objects that would not have causal power. And so saying that God is omnipotent, for example, differentiates God with his Bloch example. And we also do have a lot of positive statements about God. Even the negative predication theologians would acknowledge these, that God is the creator of the universe, a positive description, that he's the designer of the universe. The universe is ordered and law-like. It's not chaos and it's not nothing. God is the ground of morality, and so it picks out a different world. The world of moral nihilism is ruled out. We all have moral duties. And God is personal, omnipresent. He's a judge. He's a hearer of prayer. And these all speak to God being interactive in human history. Again, a positive thing we're saying about God. And finally, we'd say that God raised Jesus from the dead, and that's a concrete historical claim. It's publicly investigatable. So it's completely the opposite of the Bloch. And so each one of these definitions rules out worlds. And so by his criterion, we've made a differentiation. And also, if you think about the Kalam cosmological argument, if God doesn't exist, and that argument's sound, if God doesn't exist, then there's no universe. The universe began, and what begins to exist has a cause. And that's pretty differentiating, right? No universe at all versus there being a universe here. Now, perhaps you don't find the Kalam convincing, and that's not the point. At least the theist thinks it's convincing. And so the theist is saying something meaningful about God. And that's the claim that the speaker was making, is that we have a term without content. Well, our content would be the foundation for being. And so what I think the speaker gets wrong is that he takes all the things that the theist attributes to God for granted and then says God makes no difference. He takes for granted a material world. He takes for granted biological complexity. He takes for granted fine-tuning in the universe. And so ultimately what his argument comes out saying is, except for all the things God does, God doesn't do anything. And surely there's something wrong there. Also, the example he gave of ask 10 people and you get 10 answers, that's a sociological observation. It's not a logical one. You can ask 10 people on the street to define energy or time or what makes for a species, and you're going to get some different responses. But that doesn't mean that there aren't such things as energy, time, or species. And so really, that people would sociologically, the sociological claim that people would respond differently, that doesn't really do anything to undermine the concept of God. So that's worth pointing out. Now, his second objection was what he called the interaction problem. And what he argues is a mind with no physical substrate is somehow alters physical matter, and it's by a mechanism nobody specifies. He says that nobody's ever given a mechanism for how it is that God could interact with the physical world. He's tried to construct one and he can't. And so any mechanism that you would posit either makes God physical, and so a natural object science can study, or it violates what we understand about how physical systems work. That's the speaker's claim. So my answer would be that I'm just not entering that dilemma. He's right that no mechanism can be supplied. and I'm not going to offer one either. What I'm denying is that a mechanism is what's owed. At the fundamental level, or direct causation, there is no means by which a causal action is taken. There's no intermediary left. And so we have no reason to think that God's actions are indirect through a mechanism or an intermediary rather than direct. So, for example, consider the electron. The electron exerts an attractive force on the proton, and no mechanism has been proposed for how. Coulomb's law quantifies the force, it tells you the strength of the force, but it does not supply an intermediary. It doesn't say that by this means the electron exerts that force. So the electron doesn't pull by means of something else. That's just what electrons do. They exert this attractive force on the positive protons. Now, suppose we did find an intermediary. Well, then the same question would just move down a level. Eventually, you're going to hit a bottom where there's just direct causation. There's no further means by which one thing affects another. And Noah treats that as a scandal in physics, and so it shouldn't be a scandal with God either. So, and yes, I acknowledge that God is personal and free. The electron is impersonal and deterministic, but that's really not the point. The point is about intermediaries, not about determinism. So the point is an electron doesn't need an intermediary. There's no reason to think that God should need an intermediary either. And also, knowing that doesn't require knowing how. So knowing that God is acting doesn't require knowing how God is acting. For example, we've known that water boils when it's heated thousands of years before we knew about excited molecules. Knowing that something happens has never required knowing the mechanism in the past, so I think this demand is just too high. So I can imagine someone responding and saying, well, then that's unfalsifiable. Well, unfalsifiable doesn't mean false, and it doesn't mean unjustified. For example, I believe in the external world and I believe in other minds. I can't prove either of those, but I'm justified anyway because they're the best explanation of what I experience. And that's the same structure I'm claiming here. Whether it's unfalsifiable or not, it doesn't matter. You'd have to do more than just to say, well, I don't know how I could falsify that in order to say that it is false or unjustified. Remember, the speaker is the one making the argument here. And so it wouldn't really make his argument sound if he says that there's no way for him to justify it. That would be a problem with the argument, not a problem with my response to it. And also, I want to point out the speaker has smuggled in a controversial claim without evidence. He says that in the human case, there's always a physical substrate, neurons, electrochemical signals, and so on. And that's physicalism about the mind, asserted as a premise in an argument concluding that non-physical minds can't act. And that's circular reasoning. Asserting that because only physical minds can act, that there can be no non-physical minds that act. And physicalism about minds is far from universally held, including among atheists and agnostics. There are atheists and agnostic dualists about the human being, saying that there's both a material body and an immaterial mind. So he's sort of assuming the point in question here when he's putting forth this argument. He says that interaction would violate what we know about physical systems and how they work as well. And so I wonder here, he doesn't clarify, or maybe I missed it. I wonder if he has the laws of conservation in mind, but the physical laws describe what physical objects can do. They do not, in principle, describe what is possible for non-physical objects. So I think that interaction problem also just doesn't really have a lot of teeth to it. Now, the third issue that he raises is what he calls the complexity trap. So what he argues is that theists will often make arguments from like fine tuning, for example, an argument for design from complexity. He says, but God's mind is incredibly complex with an unimaginable amount of interconnected information. So by that logic, God should need a designer, and that one needs a designer, and on forever. So either complexity always requires explanation and we get to an infinite regress, or it sometimes doesn't, and the design argument collapses. Now, first I would say that it seems like he's making a bit of a category error here. So design arguments infer from complexity in the substance, the arrangement of physical parts for some purpose or end. God's knowledge is a complexity of information. It's not a substance. So this is not a one-to-one analogy with the fine-tuning arguments or the intelligent design arguments. And also, knowledge isn't the sort of thing that's structured for some purpose, which is where the strength of the design argument comes from. It's not just that things are complex, it's that it's complex in a way that prepares it for a particular purpose. And so it doesn't seem like knowledge works that way. Maybe it is interconnected, but it's not interconnected to fit into something. And so it just doesn't seem like it's a good analogy there. And knowing more propositions doesn't add parts to the knower. And so it just doesn't seem to have that same intuitive response that the fine-tuning argument does. A set of propositions isn't assembled together. They're just things that you know. And even if, let's say we concede all that, and even if we concede that God's knowledge itself is complex and requires a designer, well, then we would cite God as that designer. At worst, we'd have to concede that God's knowledge is arranged by God himself. And so I really don't think that we get the strength of the argument. And we also, Christians say that God in his substance is simple, not composed of parts. So adding knowledge doesn't add parts to the knower, and you don't get additional parts when you learn new things. And that's true of us. There's no reason to think it's not true of God. And this is a concept called divine simplicity, and it's not invented to escape this objection. Divine simplicity is a historic Christian doctrine. And I want to say I'm talking about divine simplicity in the sense that God is not made of parts, not the sense of essence and existence that divine simplicity theorists will put forward. There's two different kinds of divine simplicity in view here. But anyway, that argument aside, the point is that God in his substance is not composed of parts. Everybody would agree with that who is a Christian theologian anyway. So in summary, God is not complex in the same way the universe is, so there is not some demand for an external explanation. It isn't clear that complex thoughts require a designer, but even if they do, we could say God organizes his own thoughts. And adding knowledge to the knower doesn't add parts to the knower. So the complexity trap doesn't seem to spring on the concept of God. So finally, the knowledge problem. Now, what he argues is to know the future, you've got two options. Either it's fully determined, in which case free will is an illusion and divine judgment is unethical. We didn't really choose to do wrong, so God's wrong for judging us. Or future choices are completely random, in which case God's foreknowledge isn't anything like knowledge as we understand it. And so his verdict is that the concept of an omniscient God who knows the future is incoherent. And so on the determinism horn, I would kind of agree with him. I also reject determinism, and I'd say the speaker is right to say that you can't have more moral responsibility without real choice. Now, Christians do differ on this, but on the libertarian view that I hold, we would just reject determinism. And so that horn of the dilemma is dead for me. But does that leave me with just randomness? I don't think so. Notice that what his framing of the argument already assumes. His options are either determined or random. He doesn't leave space for genuine free choices. A decision made for reasons that isn't forced by prior causes has been ruled out before the argument even starts. If you think you make real decisions, then you should be suspicious of the way this is set up. And his error, I think, is in focusing on chronological versus logical priority. Now, often chronological and logical priority run in the same direction, but not always so. And this is a great example of why. He treats God's knowledge as constraining the future, presumably because God's knowledge comes chronologically first. But that assumes that God knowing what you'll do makes you do it. But why does a future tense proposition have the truth value it has? Because it corresponds to its reference, what you will actually do. Not because God made it have the value that it does, but because it's true that that is what you will do. Your action is logically prior to the truth of the proposition, even though the proposition is true chronologically prior to the action. That's just the nature of future tense statements. The content of the proposition, or the truth value of the proposition, is chronologically prior, but logically posterior to the thing it's describing. I know that's a bit technical, but C.S. Lewis had a great example He said, to watch a man do something is not to make him do it. Now, Lewis held that God sees all moments equally from an eternal now. I don't think that. I think God is temporal. But what God sees are the future tense propositions about what you will do. He didn't give them their values, but he can see what their values are. And so the idea is the same. To see what you will do is not to make you do it. And he can, these future tense propositions are true now. Since he knows all true propositions, he'll know those true propositions as well. Now, somebody might object, but God can't be wrong. And so there's a sort of sense to the claim, if God knows at time t that you will do X in the future, then when the future comes around, it has to be the case that you will do X, or else God would be wrong, and God can't be wrong. Well, what follows is that you will do X, not that you must do X. You could do otherwise, but if you would, then God's belief at t would have always have been different. And so God's knowledge is of what you will do, and what you actually will do is what makes that content true, even though it's chronologically prior. The content of the future tense proposition that God sees at t is determined by what you will do. So if you do X, then the content is that you'll do X. If you do not X, then the content would be not X. Now, some will raise a grounding worry. They'll object that something must exist now to make the future tense proposition true. But that relies on a really strong truth maker theory, and we need an independent argument for that. All that a proposition needs to be true is that it corresponds to its referent. If it's future tense, the referent is in the future. As simple as that. So God can know with certainty what you will do without determining what you will do. You determine what you will do. So to wrap up his arguments, first he argues that the term God is a label without content. Not so. We say quite a lot about God and have done in this video. He argues we can't supply a mechanism for God's interaction with the world, and he's right that we can't, but wrong that we need one. He argues that our demand for a designer of complexity should apply to God. Not so. God's thoughts may be complex, but God himself is not. And finally, he argues God's knowledge of the future implies that we make no real choices. Not so. God's knowledge of the future is knowledge of our real choices. To know what someone will do is not to make him do it. Now, he did make a point towards the end that God did it stops the inquiry. And I want to address that briefly because it is a common complaint. And the first thing I'd say is that levels of explanation don't compete. The kettle is boiling because of convection currents and because I wanted tea. Both are true and neither shuts the other down. So looking for design in the why doesn't at all shut down the inquiry about how. So the God did it explanation operates just on a different level from science. Why are there laws at all? Why are they intelligible? Why can a mind track them? Historically, also, belief in design has motivated rather than stymied inquiry. For example, Johannes Kepler, he discovered elliptical orbits motivated by his belief in design. More recently, intelligent design theorists predicted the functionality of non-coding sections of DNA. Both of these were motivated by belief in design rather than stymied by it. So what I would say is that none of these arguments show that God is incoherent. The concept of God holds up. Thank you for listening.